Welcome to the story of the letter written in blood. I am your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey, but before we start, let me know from which city are you watching from, and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about. Chapter 1. The Letter That Should Not Exist. It was on one of those grey November mornings, when London seems to draw its curtains against itself, that the matter of Arthur Pembroke first entered our lives. I remember the date with unusual precision, the 14th, because I had spent the previous quarter of an hour reading aloud from the Times in the vain hope that some item might rouse Holmes from the torpor that had settled upon him like a fog. He had not moved from his armchair in 3 days. The violin lay untouched upon the settee. His pipe had gone cold in its rack. The Persian slipper, stuffed with shag tobacco, sat undisturbed on the mantelpiece, and the morning's post lay unopened on the table beside his untouched breakfast. I had seen these moods before, the black, listless intervals between cases when that extraordinary mind, deprived of stimulus, turned inward upon itself like a starving creature gnawing at its own limbs. There is a rather interesting account of a warehouse fire in Bermondsey, I ventured, turning the page with what I hoped was an air of casual interest. Electrical fault, said Holmes without opening his eyes. Third paragraph will mention a recently installed dynamo. The owner is underinsured and will claim arson within the week. Dull. I glanced at the third paragraph. There was, indeed, a dynamo. And a burglary in Watson. His voice was flat, almost pleading. If the next words from your lips contain the phrase "of some interest," I shall be forced to take up the revolver and shoot the wall again, and Mrs. Hudson has only just had it replastered. I set the paper down. There was nothing to be done. When Holmes was in this state, only a case of genuine complexity could reach him, and London, it seemed, had decided to behave itself. It was at precisely that moment, as though the city had heard my silent reproach and wished to correct itself, that the bell rang below, followed by the hurried tread of boots upon the stair. The door was flung open without ceremony, and Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard stood upon the threshold. I had known Lestrade for many years. He was a man of considerable professional composure, lean, sharp-featured, and not easily shaken. But the man who stood before us that morning was none of those things. His collar was loosened, his overcoat was unbuttoned despite the bitter cold, and in his gloved hand he carried a flat leather evidence case, which he held before him as one might hold a thing that was either very precious or very dangerous. "Mr. Holmes," he said, and I noted that his voice was not entirely steady. "I need you to look at something." Holmes opened one eye, then both. He regarded Lestrade for a long moment, and I saw it happen, that transformation I had witnessed so many times and never ceased to marvel at. The languor fell from him like a discarded coat. His eyes sharpened, his posture straightened. He was, in the space of a single breath, entirely alive. "Sit down, Inspector," said Holmes, gesturing to the basket chair. "You have come directly from the yard. No, from a crime scene, by way of the yard. There is plaster dust on your left cuff that does not match the yard's flooring, and the mud on your boots is Belgravia clay, that particular yellow variety found nowhere else in central London. You have handled something that disturbed you. Your gloves are on, which you never wear indoors, meaning you have not removed them since handling evidence, and whatever is in that case arrived at Scotland Yard this morning, but relates to something that happened last night." Lestrade sat down heavily. "All of it," he said, "every word." "Then show me what you have brought." Lestrade opened the evidence case. Inside, pressed flat between 2 sheets of glass to preserve it, lay a single piece of paper. It was cheap stock, the kind sold in bulk at any stationer's for a penny a sheet. But it was not the paper that seized my attention. The letter was written in blood. The characters were large, perhaps 2 inches tall, formed with a crude but deliberate hand. The blood had dried to a dark rust-brown colour, and the edges of each stroke were slightly feathered, as though the writing instrument had been soft. Not a pen nib, but something broader, something pliable. The message was brief. It read, "Pembroke will answer for what he buried." Holmes rose from his chair and crossed to the table in 2 strides. He bent over the glass case, producing his lens from his pocket in a single fluid motion. For perhaps 30 seconds he said nothing. He examined the strokes of each letter, the texture of the dried blood, the paper beneath it. He tilted the glass to catch the light from the window. He brought the lens so close to the surface that his breath fogged the glass, and he wiped it away impatiently with his sleeve. Then he straightened and spoke. "The writer is educated. The letter formation is consistent. No hesitation marks, no misspellings, no uneven spacing. This was composed by someone accustomed to written communication, not a labourer or an illiterate." He paused. "Left-handed. The downstrokes pull consistently to the left, and the horizontal bars of the letters slope downward from left to right, the natural bias of a left hand dragging across a surface. The writing instrument was not a pen. There are fibre impressions in the dried blood, here and here." He indicated 2 points with the tip of his lens. "A cloth, wrapped around a finger, I should think. The writer dipped their finger in blood and wrote with it, using the cloth for control." He straightened fully and fixed Lestrade with a gaze that had lost every trace of that morning's lethargy. "But the most interesting feature, Inspector, is the blood itself. It is unusually dark, almost black at the thickest points of application, and the coagulation pattern. You see how the edges have dried with this particular cracking. This is not the blood of a man writing in his death throes. This blood was dead before it reached the paper. It was stored, collected, kept in some vessel, and applied later." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice carried a quality I had rarely heard from him. Not excitement, but something closer to unease. "This is not the blood of a dying man, Lestrade. This is the blood of something that was already dead." The room was silent for a moment. Then Lestrade spoke. "The letter was delivered to Scotland Yard in this morning's post, postmarked 3 days ago, from a central London sorting office. No return address. It was opened by a clerk who very nearly fainted and brought it immediately to my desk." He drew a breath. "Mr. Holmes, Arthur Pembroke, the retired Crown Prosecutor, was found dead in his study this morning. Stabbed. His butler discovered the body at 7:15. Holmes had not moved. His eyes were fixed on the letter, but I could see that his mind was working behind them at a speed I could not hope to follow. "There is more," said Lestrade. "On the wall of his study behind the desk someone has written a message. In blood. Large letters, 8 inches tall, the constable estimated. It reads, 'He knew the truth.'" "The same hand?" Holmes asked. "I cannot say. I came here first. The body is still in the study." Holmes turned from the letter and crossed to the window. He stood there for a moment with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the grey street below, where a hansom cab clattered past, and a boy in a flat cap was selling roasted chestnuts on the corner. When he turned back, his expression was one I had learned, over long years of association, to regard with a particular kind of attention. It was not the bright, almost manic energy he displayed when presented with an intellectual puzzle. It was something quieter and more intent. The look of a man who has recognized not merely a problem, but a design. "A message that arrives before the crime," he said softly, almost to himself, "is not a warning. It is a stage direction." Lestrade frowned. "I beg your pardon." "Consider, Inspector. This letter was posted 3 days ago. It it announces a crime that occurred last night. If the writer intended to warn Pembroke, the letter would have been sent to Pembroke. It was sent to Scotland Yard. If the writer intended to prevent the crime, The timing would have allowed for intervention. Instead, it was calculated to arrive the morning after the murder, too late to save, but perfectly timed to horrify. He picked up the evidence case and held it before Lestrade as though it were an exhibit in a courtroom. "This letter was not written to stop anything, Inspector. It was written to begin something. It is the opening act. And we, you, I, Watson, Scotland Yard, the press, we are the audience." He set the case down with a decisiveness that I knew well. The case had taken him, or rather, he had taken the case. "Tell me everything you know about Arthur Pembroke," he said, sinking into his armchair and pressing his fingertips together in that characteristic gesture of concentrated thought. Lestrade consulted a small notebook from his breast pocket. Age 62, retired from the Crown Prosecution Service 8 years ago, celebrated career, 30 years, dozens of successful convictions, awarded the Order of the Bath. Since retirement, he's worked as a private legal consultant, lived in Pembroke House, Belgravia. Household of 5, a cook, a housekeeper who was away visiting family, a butler named Hargreaves who has been with him 22 years, a personal secretary, a young woman, Miss Emily Ward, and a valet. Enemies? A Crown prosecutor of 30 years? He'll have made enemies enough to fill this room, Mr. Holmes, but no specific threats that we're aware of. The man was respected, feared perhaps by some, but respected. And the nephew, Holmes said. Lestrade looked up sharply. How did you... Pembroke was unmarried and childless, a man of that age and stature, living alone in Belgravia with a full household staff, suggests no immediate family. Yet the estate is substantial. Someone inherits. You would have checked the will within the hour. Lestrade closed his notebook with a faint look of irritation that I had seen him direct at Holmes 100 times before. Reginald Pembroke, sole nephew, sole heir, age 34. He has debts, gambling debts. According to my sergeant, who made some preliminary inquiries, he visited his uncle 2 days ago. The butler says they argued, loudly. About what? Hargreaves couldn't, or wouldn't, say precisely, but he mentioned the word evidence was used more than once. Holmes's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. I saw it, that faint contraction of the brow that meant a piece had been placed upon the board, though its significance was not yet clear. Interesting, he murmured. A nephew with debts argues with his uncle about evidence, and 2 days later the uncle is dead, and a message in blood declares that Pembroke will answer for what he buried. He unfolded himself from the chair with sudden energy. Come, Watson, your coat and your revolver. Lestrade, we shall meet you at Pembroke House. You'll take the case, then? Lestrade asked, though the answer was already evident. My dear Lestrade, I took the case the moment you walked through that door with plaster dust on your cuff and terror in your eyes. Within 10 minutes, we were in a hansom cab, rattling through the grey London streets toward Belgravia. Holmes sat beside me in silence, his chin sunk upon his chest, his fingers drumming an irregular rhythm upon his knee. The fog had thickened since morning, and the gaslight along the Marylebone Road burned with a sickly yellow haze that turned the passing pedestrians into ghosts. I did not speak. I had learned over many years to recognise the quality of Holmes's silences. There was the companionable silence of satisfaction after a case well solved. There was the taut silence of a man following a trail of thought to its conclusion. And there was this, a silence that was neither restful nor productive, but watchful, wary. I had seen Holmes animated by a new puzzle 100 times. The thrill of the chase, as he himself called it, was the breath of his existence. But this was different. He was not intrigued. He was disturbed. As we turned onto Belgrave Square, the fog parted momentarily, and the pale November sun caught the brass plate of a passing carriage. Holmes looked up. Watson, he said, and his voice was quiet enough that I had to lean closer to hear it above the clatter of hooves. When a man is murdered, there is chaos. When a man is murdered, and the killer leaves a message, there is arrogance. But when a man is murdered, a message is left, and a letter predicting the crime arrives at Scotland Yard on the very morning the body is found. That is not chaos, and it is not arrogance. He turned to me, and in his grey eyes I saw something that I can only describe as professional respect, the recognition of a mind that had, in some measure, anticipated his own methods. That is architecture. Someone has built this crime the way a playwright builds a drama. Every element placed, every timing calculated, every audience considered. He looked away toward the approaching facade of Pembroke House, where 2 police constables stood at the door like sentinels before a tomb. And the question that concerns me, Watson, the question that concerns me above all others is this: what is the final act? The cab drew to a halt. Holmes stepped down onto the pavement without waiting for me, his coat billowing behind him in the damp November wind. I followed, and as I did, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, not fear precisely, but the awareness that we were stepping across a threshold from the ordinary world into the particular darkness that only Holmes's cases could illuminate. The door to Pembroke House stood open. Beyond it, the hallway was dim, and the smell of old wood and cold stone drifted out to meet us like the breath of the house itself. Holmes paused on the step. He did not look back at me, but he spoke, and his words carried the weight of a man who has seen something in a piece of blood-stained paper that he has not yet shared and is not yet prepared to name. "Mind where you step, Watson," he said. "Every surface in that house is a page, and someone has written us a story." He walked inside. I followed, and the case of the letter written in blood began. Chapter 2. The Study of a Dead Man. Pembroke House was handsome in the way that old money is handsome, not showy but assured. A Georgian townhouse of pale stone set back from the street behind wrought-iron railings, with tall windows that reflected the November sky like lidded eyes. The constables at the door stepped aside without a word as Lestrade led us through. The entrance hall was narrow and high-ceilinged, papered in deep green above dark wainscoting. A grandfather clock ticked with mechanical indifference against the far wall, and the air carried the mingled scents of beeswax polish, cold stone, and something else. Something faint and metallic that I recognized from battlefields and hospital wards alike, the smell of blood, hours old. Lestrade led us up the staircase to the first floor. The study door stood open, flanked by another constable who looked rather pale about the gills. Holmes entered first. I followed, and then I stopped. Arthur Pembroke sat at his desk. That was the first impression, and it was a carefully constructed lie. He was seated upright in a high-backed leather chair, his hands placed flat upon the desk's surface as though he had been reviewing papers and simply paused. His head was inclined slightly forward. His eyes were closed. Had it not been for the unnatural stillness, that absolute, terrible absence of breath, one might have thought he had fallen asleep over his work. But no sleeping man has that colour. The skin of his face had taken on the greyish-yellow hue of tallow, and his lips were faintly blue. He was dressed in a dark suit, his waistcoat buttoned neatly to the throat, his cravat still knotted. "May I?" I asked Lestrade, already reaching for my bag. "Please, Doctor." I approached the body with professional detachment, though the staging of it, for I could already feel that it was staged, though I could not yet have said why, made the hairs rise on the back of my neck. I unbuttoned the waistcoat, and there it was, a single wound beneath the left ribs, narrow, deep. The blade had entered at a slightly upward angle, penetrating between the lower ribs and into the thoracic cavity. There was remarkably little external blood, a dark stain no larger than my palm, already dried to a stiff crust against his shirt. Single stab wound, I said, straightening. A thin blade, very thin, almost surgical in its precision. The entry is clean, no tearing or lateral damage. Penetration was upward, us suggesting the assailant struck from a standing position while the victim was seated. Death would have been rapid. The blade likely punctured the left ventricle or the aorta. Internal hemorrhage would have been catastrophic, but externally, I gestured at the modest stain. Almost nothing. No defensive wounds? Holmes asked. He had not yet approached the body. He stood in the centre of the room, turning slowly, his eyes moving across every surface with that peculiar, consuming attention that I had never seen equalled in any other man. I examined Pembroke's hands, his forearms, his neck. None. No bruising, no scratches, no torn nails. He did not struggle. He did not even raise his hands. Because he did not see it coming, Holmes murmured. Or rather, he saw the person coming and felt no alarm. He approached the body at last, but he did not look at the wound. Instead, he bent close to the dead man's face, then moved to his hands, then to the chair itself. He pressed his fingers against the skin of the forearms, then against the backs of the thighs beneath the desk. Watson, observe the lividity. I looked more carefully. Lividity, the settling of blood after death drawn by gravity, should have pooled in the lowest parts of the body. In a man seated upright, that would be the buttocks, the backs of the thighs, and the lower back. But the discoloration I could see was not consistent. The pooling was heaviest in the legs and lower back, as expected. But the pattern extended oddly. There was faint lividity along the left flank and the left shoulder, as though the body had lain on its side for a period before being placed upright. He was moved, I said. He was moved, Holmes confirmed. After death, the blood settled while he lay in one position, and then someone sat him up. Someone arranged him. He stepped back and regarded the body with an expression I could not readily interpret. Not disgust, not pity, but something colder. Recognition. Someone placed his hands on the desk. Someone buttoned his waistcoat over the wound to conceal the blood. Buttoned it, Lestrade said sharply. You mean? I mean that a man who has been stabbed beneath the ribs does not then calmly button his waistcoat. The buttoning occurred after death. The killer dressed the scene. He turned to me. Watson, the waistcoat was already unbuttoned when the blow was struck. The stain on the shirt extends upward, unconstrained by fabric. The waistcoat was buttoned over it afterward, pressing the shirt flat against the wound. The killer wanted the body to appear undisturbed, composed, as though death had come quietly. He left the body and moved to the wall behind the desk. I had been so focused on the corpse that I had not yet looked beyond it. Now I did, and the breath caught in my throat. On the dark wood panelling behind the desk, written in letters approximately 8 inches tall, were 4 words. He knew the truth. The blood, if blood it was, had been applied thickly, each letter formed with broad, deliberate strokes. It had dried to the same rust-brown colour as the letter Lestrade had shown us at Baker Street, and the edges of the strokes showed the same feathered quality, the mark of a soft instrument, not a pen or brush. Holmes approached the wall as a scholar approaches a manuscript. He measured the height of the topmost letters with his outstretched hand. He crouched to examine the lowest strokes. He leaned close and inhaled, a long, deliberate breath through his nostrils, as a wine merchant might sample a vintage. Then he crossed to the body and did the same, lowering his face to within inches of the wound stain on the shirt and breathing in. He said nothing, but I saw his jaw tighten. From his coat pocket he produced 2 small glass vials and a thin metal spatula. With practised efficiency, he scraped a sample of blood from the wall into one vial, and a sample from the wound stain into the other. He stoppered both and held them up to the light from the window, turning them slowly. "Are they the same?" I asked. Holmes looked at me over the tops of the vials. His expression was unreadable. That, Watson, is precisely the question. He pocketed the vials and turned his attention to the rest of the study. It was a substantial room, 15 feet by 20, I estimated, lined on 2 walls with bookshelves that reached to the ceiling. A fireplace occupied the wall opposite the desk, its grate swept clean. The desk itself was a large mahogany piece, well ordered, a blotter, an inkstand, a pen tray, a small stack of correspondence, and, sitting innocently in a brass stand at the right-hand corner, a letter opener. Holmes picked it up. It was an elegant thing, decorative in the way that such objects often are in a gentleman's study, a slender blade of Sheffield steel, perhaps 7 inches long, with an ivory handle carved in a classical pattern. He turned it in the light. "Recently cleaned," he said. "There is a faint residue of oil along the blade, the kind one uses to maintain a fine edge. The handle has been wiped, but not thoroughly. There are traces of a cloth's weave in the crevices of the carving." He set it down again, precisely where it had been. "The blade is consistent with the wound. Thin, narrow, sharp enough to penetrate between the ribs with a single controlled thrust." "You think that's the weapon?" Lestrade asked. "I think it was on this desk before the murder. I think it was used, and I think it was cleaned and returned to its place afterward." He paused. "A killer who brings a weapon intends violence. A killer who uses the victim's own weapon and then replaces it, that is something else entirely. That is someone who wished to leave no trace of their presence. He's someone who wanted this room to tell a specific story and no other." He moved through the study with methodical intensity. He examined the window latches, both locked from the inside. He inspected the fireplace. No recent ash, no fragments of burned paper. He ran his fingers along the bookshelves, checking for gaps or disturbances. He opened each desk drawer, examined the contents, and closed it again. He studied the carpet for footprints, stains, or disturbances in the pile. At last, he straightened and addressed the room as though pronouncing a verdict. "No one searched this room, and no one broke in. The windows are latched from within. The door shows no sign of forced entry. The desk drawers are orderly, nothing rifled, nothing displaced. The bookshelves are undisturbed." He turned to face the body one final time. "Whoever killed Arthur Pembroke entered this room through the door, by invitation or by right. They approached the desk without resistance. They killed him with a single blow using an instrument that was already here. They then spent several minutes, at minimum, repositioning the body, buttoning the waistcoat, writing a message on the wall in blood, cleaning the weapon, and returning it to its place. They did all of this without haste, without panic, and without leaving a single sign of struggle or flight." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "This was not a crime of passion, gentlemen. This was a performance, choreographed, rehearsed, and executed with a precision that speaks of weeks, perhaps months, of preparation. The question is not merely who killed Arthur Pembroke. The question is who wrote this particular story and why they wanted us to read it." Lestrade had been scribbling in his notebook throughout. Now he looked up. "The nephew, Reginald Pembroke. He has a key to the house. He was at his club last night, but the steward can only account for him until 9:30. The murder appears to have occurred sometime around 10 o'clock, based on the body temperature when the surgeon arrived." "Appears?" Holmes repeated, as though tasting the word. "Yes, it appears." He did not elaborate. "I'll want to speak with the household," Holmes continued, pulling on his gloves. "The butler, the cook, the secretary, Miss Ward, was it? Everyone who was in this house last night. And I shall want the name and address of every person who visited Pembroke in the past fortnight." "I can arrange that for this afternoon," said Lestrade. "This morning, Inspector. Whoever built this crime did not leave it unfinished. There will be more to find." The question is whether we find it before it finds us. We descended the stairs in silence. In the entrance hall, the grandfather clock continued its indifferent ticking, measuring out the seconds of a house whose master would never hear it again. A woman in a cook's apron stood in the doorway to the service passage, her face blotched with weeping, twisting a dishcloth in her hands. Beside her, rigid as a sentry, stood a tall, grey-haired man in a butler's dark suit, Hargreaves, I presumed. His face was the colour of old parchment, and his hands, the clasp before him at the waist, trembled with a fine, persistent vibration that no amount of professional composure could disguise, and behind them both, half in shadow at the far end of the passage, stood a young woman. She was slight, neatly dressed in dark blue, her hair pinned simply beneath a plain cap. She watched us descend with an expression of quiet attentiveness, not tearful like the cook, not rigid like the butler, but still, perfectly, absolutely still. I noted her presence without particular interest. A secretary, I assumed, a young woman in service, observing the disruption of her household with the composure that her position demanded. Holmes, I noticed, looked at her for a fraction longer than was necessary. Then he turned away, and we stepped out into the grey November morning. The fog had thickened. Belgravia's white facades had become ghosts of themselves, and the street lamps burned with dim, futile persistence against the gloom. Holmes stood on the pavement, drawing on his gloves, and said nothing for a long moment. "Well," I asked, "what do you make of it?" "I make several things of it, Watson, and they do not yet agree with one another." He hailed a passing cab with a sharp gesture. "But I will tell you this. The man who lies in that study was not merely killed. He was exhibited. The body, the message, the letter to Scotland Yard. It is a prosecution. Someone has put Arthur Pembroke on trial, and they have done so with a thoroughness that suggests they learned the art from the man himself." He climbed into the cab. I followed. As we pulled away, I glanced back at Pembroke House. The door had been closed. The constables stood at attention, and somewhere behind those tall, blank windows, a dead man sat at his desk in a room that had been arranged with terrible care to tell a story. I did not yet know what that story was, but I was beginning to understand, as Holmes already did, that whoever had written it was still turning the pages. Chapter 3. The Woman Who Did Not Panic. We returned to Pembroke House that same afternoon. The fog had not lifted. If anything, it had thickened into that particular yellow-grey murk that turns London into a city of suggestions, where every passing figure is half dissolved and every sound arrives muffled, as though wrapped in cloth. Lestrade met us at the door with the news that the household had been assembled in the morning-room and were prepared to be interviewed. "How are they?" Holmes asked as we crossed the threshold. "The cook hasn't stopped weeping since this morning. The butler looks as though he's been carved from granite, and the secretary," Lestrade shrugged, quiet, polite, offered to make tea for the constables. Holmes made no reply, but I saw a faint crease appear between his brows, a momentary contraction that vanished as quickly as it came. The morning room was a modest space at the rear of the ground floor, papered in faded yellow silk and furnished with the kind of comfortable, unremarkable pieces that accumulate in houses where no one entertains. 3 chairs had been arranged facing a 4th, which Holmes claimed without invitation, leaving Watson and Lestrade to stand on either side like seconds at a duel. Mrs. Price was brought in first. She was a stout woman of perhaps 50, with red-rimmed eyes and hands that could not be still. She clutched a handkerchief in her left fist and twisted it continuously as she spoke, and twice during her account she broke off entirely, overcome by a fresh wave of distress that required several moments to subside. Her testimony was simple and, so far as I could judge, entirely genuine. She had prepared Mr. Pembroke's dinner as usual, a light meal of cold mutton and bread, which he took alone in the dining-room at 8 o'clock. She had cleared the dishes by 8:30, and retired to the kitchen to begin preparations for the following morning's breakfast. Miss Ward had joined her in the kitchen at approximately 9:30, and they had shared a pot of tea. "And you remained in the kitchen together until when?" Holmes asked. "Until I went up to bed, sir. That would have been just gone 10:30. "You did not leave the kitchen at any point during that hour?" Mrs. Price hesitated. It was a tiny hesitation, a breath's width, but Holmes was watching her with the stillness of a cat at a mouse hole, and I saw his posture shift almost imperceptibly. "Well, sir, I did step out for just a moment, around 10 o'clock, as I always do, to check the front door is locked and bolted for the night. It's my habit, sir. I've done it every evening for the 12 years I've been in this house. Mr. Hargreaves usually sees to the back, and I see to the front." "And how long does this take you, Mrs. Price?" "Oh, not long at all, sir. 5 minutes, perhaps. I check the door, draw the chain, and have a look at the windows in the front parlour while I'm about it. Sometimes 7 minutes if the bolt is stiff. It does stick in the cold weather." "And Miss Ward remained in the kitchen during this time?" "She did, sir. She was sitting just where I'd left her when I came back, drinking her tea." Holmes nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. Price. You have been most helpful." She was led out, still twisting the handkerchief, and replaced by Frederick Hargreaves. The butler was a different creature entirely. Where Mrs. Price was soft and undone by grief, Hargreaves was rigid with it. He entered the room as though presenting himself for inspection, back straight, chin raised, hands clasped at his waist. But the tremor I had noted earlier was still there, a persistent vibration in his fingers that he could not entirely suppress, and the skin beneath his eyes was dark with exhaustion. He confirmed the essential details of the household routine. Mr. Pembroke had dined alone, as was his custom. Miss Ward had delivered the evening correspondence summary to the study at approximately 8:30. Hargreaves himself had attended to his duties until 9:45, at which point he retired to his quarters on the ground floor, directly below the study. "And you heard nothing during the night?" Holmes asked. "Nothing, sir. My quarters are immediately beneath the study, but the floors in this house are solid. Good Georgian construction. One does not hear much." "You mentioned to Inspector Lestrade that Mr. Pembroke's nephew visited 2 days ago. Tell me about that visit." Something shifted behind Hargreaves' careful composure, a tightening of the jaw, a fractional lowering of the gaze. "Mr. Reginald arrived at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, sir. He went directly to the study. I brought tea at 4:15. At that time, the conversation appeared civil." "And later?" "I was in the hall at approximately 5 o'clock when the voices became raised. Mr. Reginald was, if you will forgive me, shouting. It was quite unlike his usual manner. He is generally a mild-spoken gentleman, whatever his other difficulties." "His other difficulties?" Holmes prompted. Hargreaves's lips pressed together. The loyalty of 22 years warred visibly with the pressure of the moment. "I do not wish to speak ill of the family, sir." "The family, Mr. Hargreaves, now consists of 1 dead man and 1 heir. Your discretion, while admirable, is no longer serviceable. What did you hear?" A pause. "Then I could not make out the substance of the argument, sir. The doors in this house are thick, but I heard certain words clearly enough. Mr. Reginald said evidence more than once, and at one point, I am quite certain of this, he said, 'You cannot bury this forever.'" Holmes leaned forward. "Those were his exact words? 'You cannot bury this forever?'" "Yes, sir. I am certain. Mr. Reginald left the house shortly afterward. He did not take his leave of me, which was unusual. He went out through the front door and slammed it behind him. Mr. Pembroke did not emerge from the study for the rest of the evening." "One more question, Mr. Hargreaves. In your 22 years of service, did Mr. Pembroke ever receive visitors whom he did not wish the household to know about? Late-night callers, perhaps? Hushed conversations?" The tremor in Hargreaves's hands intensified. "I am a butler, sir. It is my business to be present and to be invisible. I have seen a great many things in this house that were not my concern. That is not an answer. No, sir, said Hargreaves quietly. It is not. Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then nodded. Thank you, Mr. Hargreaves. That will be all for now. The butler rose, inclined his head with formal precision, and left the room. His footsteps retreated down the corridor with the measured regularity of a metronome, the walk of a man who has disciplined every outward expression of feeling into the performance of his role. And then Emily Ward entered. She came in without hesitation, without the tentative shuffle of Mrs. Price, or the martial bearing of Hargreaves. She walked to the chair, but sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and looked directly at Holmes with an expression of composed attention, the look of a capable woman awaiting instruction. She was young, 27 I later learned, and slight of build, with dark hair pinned neatly beneath a plain cap. Her dress was the same dark blue I had glimpsed earlier, simple and well kept. Her face was not remarkable in any conventional sense, but it possessed a quality of stillness that I found, in that moment, rather admirable. In a household shattered by violent death, Miss Ward appeared to have retained her faculties entirely. Miss Ward, Holmes began, you are Mr. Pembroke's personal secretary. I am, sir. I have held the position for 3 years. And your duties? I manage Mr. Pembroke's correspondence, his diary, and his legal files. I prepare a daily summary of incoming letters and a schedule of appointments. In the evening, I compile any outstanding items and deliver them to the study at 8:30. Which you did last night. I did. I brought the summary to the study at approximately 25 minutes past 8. Mr. Pembroke was at his desk. He thanked me, as he always does. Did. And I withdrew. How did he seem? As he always seemed, sir, composed, attentive. He asked whether the Whitfield correspondence had arrived, and I told him it had not. He said that was no matter, and wished me good evening. And then? I went downstairs. I attended to some filing in the small office beside the kitchen. It is where I keep the secondary correspondence records. And then joined Mrs. Price in the kitchen at 9:30. We had tea. I remained there until Mrs. Price retired at 10:30, and then I went to my own room. Holmes studied her. I had seen him study 100 witnesses, nervous men, lying women, frightened children, defiant criminals. Each produced in him a different quality of attention. With Miss Ward I saw something I could not immediately classify. He was watching her the way one watches a mechanism whose function is not yet apparent, with interest, but also with patience. Miss Ward, when did you learn of Mr. Pembroke's death? This morning, sir. Mr. Hargreaves came to my room at approximately 20 minutes past 7. He was very pale. He told me that Mr. Pembroke had been found dead in his study, and that the police had been summoned. I dressed and came downstairs at once. And what was your reaction? A brief pause, the first she had permitted herself. I was shocked, sir. Mr. Pembroke was a vigorous man. I had seen him only hours before, in apparently perfect health. Shocked, Holmes repeated. Not frightened? I did not feel I was in any danger, sir. Should I have? It was a perfectly reasonable answer, and yet something in its delivery, its precision, its lack of excess, struck me in a way I could not articulate. I made a note of it in my mind, meaning to consider it later. Miss Ward bore herself with remarkable composure for a young woman who had so recently been in the service of a murdered man. I thought it spoke well of her character, a steady temperament, the kind of practical steadiness one hopes for in a crisis. In Holmes asked several more questions about the household routine, about visitors in recent weeks, about Pembroke's temperament and habits. Miss Ward answered each with the same measured clarity. She neither volunteered information nor withheld it. She did not fidget, did not avert her gaze, did not contradict herself. She was, in every respect, the model of a reliable witness. When the interview was concluded, she rose, inclined her head, and left the room with the same unhurried composure with which she had entered. The door closed behind her. Lestrade consulted his notes. I reached for my coat. Holmes sat motionless in his chair, his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, staring at the door through which Emily Ward had just departed. "Well," said Lestrade, tucking his notebook away, "the nephew's looking more promising by the hour, wouldn't you say? Motive, opportunity, a key to the house, and that argument about evidence. Whatever Pembroke was burying, it seems his nephew knew about it." Holmes did not respond immediately. He was still looking at the door. "Holmes," I said. He stirred as though waking from a brief reverie, and rose from his chair. "Yes, the nephew. Quite." He pulled on his gloves and moved toward the corridor. "Lestrade, I want Reginald Pembroke's movements traced for the entire evening. Every club, every alehouse, every cab. I want to know where he was at every quarter hour between 9 o'clock and midnight." "Already in hand," said Lestrade. "Good." Holmes paused at the front door. The fog had thickened again, and the street lamps had been lit early, yet their light diffusing through the murk in pale, useless halos. He stood on the threshold for a moment, looking out into the gloom. "Lestrade," he said without turning. "A question." The cook wept, the butler trembled. The valet, I understand, was so distressed he was given leave. A man of 62, well liked by his staff, is found murdered in his own study, and every member of his household reacts with grief, shock, or fear. He turned his head just slightly. "Every member but one." Lestrade frowned. "You mean the secretary?" "I mean that grief rarely presents itself with such discipline." I assumed naturally that he was referring to Hargreaves, the butler's professional composure, his refusal to yield to the visible tremor in his hands. It was precisely the kind of observation Holmes would make, a man's control as a measure of his character. It was not until much later, far too late, that I understood he had not been speaking of Hargreaves at all. We took a cab back to Baker Street. Holmes was silent for the journey, his chin sunk upon his chest, his eyes half closed. I occupied myself with reviewing my notes and forming what I believed was a reasonable picture of the case. A retired prosecutor with a ruthless reputation and at least one buried secret. A nephew in debt, with a temper and a key to the house. An argument about evidence. A threatening letter written in blood. A body staged with theatrical care. It seemed, to my mind, increasingly clear. I did not yet appreciate how wrong I was. Chapter 4. Blood that Tells a Lie. I have, over the years, grown accustomed to the particular rhythms of Holmes's investigative process. There is the initial seizure, that electric moment when the problem first takes hold of him, and the lethargy of idle days falls away like a shed skin. There is the gathering, the voracious intake of data, of impressions, of testimony, during which he speaks little and observes everything. And then there is the phase I had come to think of as the distillation, when Holmes retreats into himself and subjects the accumulated evidence to the crucible of that extraordinary mind. It was in this third phase that I found him the following morning. I had risen early, hoping for conversation over breakfast, but found the sitting room already transformed. Holmes had commandeered the deal-top table by the window, the one Mrs. Hudson had long since surrendered to his chemical experiments, and arranged upon it a formidable array of apparatus. His microscope stood at the centre, flanked by racks of glass slides, a spirit lamp, several reagent bottles with handwritten labels, a graduated pipette, and the 2 small vials he had filled at Pembroke's study, one containing blood scraped from the wall, the other from the wound on the dead man's shirt. He was bent over the microscope when I entered, still wearing the mouse-coloured dressing gown he favoured for indoor work, his pipe clenched unlit between his teeth. He did not look up. "Good morning, Watson," he said, adjusting the focus wheel with a delicacy that would have done credit to a Swiss watchmaker. "The coffee is cold. Mrs. Hudson brought it an hour ago. I recommend the toast, She has used that particular marmalade you favour, the Seville. I poured myself a cup of the cold coffee without complaint. I had long since abandoned the hope of hot beverages when Holmes was at his chemical work, and settled into my armchair with the morning papers. They had, predictably, seized upon the case with the appetite of wolves. "Blood-letter murder in Belgravia," declared the Daily Telegraph, in letters nearly as large as those on Pembroke's wall. "Retired prosecutor found slain. Mysterious message written in blood." The Standard was only slightly more restrained. "Pembroke murder. Scotland Yard baffled by prophetic letter." The Pall Mall Gazette, never one to resist sensation, had gone further still. "Who wrote in blood? The Phantom Avenger of Belgravia." I read portions aloud. Holmes made no response. He was entirely absorbed, moving between the microscope, the reagent bottles, and his own scrawled notes with a concentration so absolute that I doubt he heard a word I said. Twice he held slides up to the grey window light and examined them with his lens. 3 times he applied drops from different bottles to samples on glass, watching the reactions with the intensity of a man watching a fuse burn toward powder. 40 minutes passed in this fashion. I had finished the papers, consumed 2 pieces of toast, and was beginning to contemplate a walk when Holmes straightened abruptly from the microscope, removed his pipe from his teeth, and spoke. "The blood on the wall is not human, Watson." I set down my coffee cup. Not human?" "It is the blood of a pig." He said it with the flat certainty that was his hallmark, not as a theory or a suspicion, but as a fact, delivered with the same inflection another man might use to announce that it was raining. "The cellular structure is unmistakable under magnification. Porcine erythrocytes are markedly different from human. They are smaller, more uniform, and they lack the characteristic biconcave shape. I have confirmed it with 3 separate reagent tests. There is no possibility of error." He picked up one of the vials, the one containing the wool sample, and held it toward the window. In the pale light, the dried residue within was dark, almost black. "Furthermore," he continued, "the coagulation pattern is not consistent with blood that was shed and immediately applied. This blood was collected, stored in a sealed vessel, a jar most likely, and applied to the wall within 2 to 3 days of collection. The degradation of the fibrin networks, the oxidation pattern, the particular dryness of the outer layer, all point to blood that was dead, Watson, before it ever touched that wall. Collected from a butcher's block or a slaughterhouse floor, kept sealed against the air, and brought to Pembroke's study as deliberately as a painter brings his pigments to a canvas." He set the vial down and picked up the other, the wound sample. "This, by contrast, is human blood. The cellular structure confirms it. It is fresh, or was, at the time of death. It came from Arthur Pembroke's body, and there is very little of it." He turned to face me, and I saw in his expression not triumph, but the taut, focused energy of a hound that has caught a scent and knows that the trail, though long, is now certain. "Consider what this means, Watson. The wound that killed Pembroke was made by a thin blade driven deep beneath the ribs. Such a wound produces catastrophic internal hemorrhage. The chest cavity fills with blood, but very little external bleeding. The entry point is narrow. The blood flows inward, not outward. The stain on Pembroke's shirt was no larger than the palm of my hand." "And the message on the wall," I said, beginning to see where he was leading, "required far more blood than that wound could ever produce. The letters were 8 inches tall, Watson. 4 words. The strokes were thick, applied generously. I estimate the message consumed between 1 and 2 pints of blood. The wound on Pembroke's body could not have produced a tenth of that volume externally." He paused, allowing the implication to settle. "The blood on the wall did not come from the victim. It was brought to the scene. It was prepared in advance, and it was applied by the same person who drove that blade between Arthur Pembroke's ribs." I sat in silence for a moment, turning this over. The implications were considerable, and they rearranged the architecture of the crime in ways I was only beginning to grasp. Then the message was not written in the heat of the moment, I said slowly. It was planned, prepared, rehearsed in all probability. The killer obtained pig's blood days before the murder, if the coagulation evidence is correct. They stored it. They brought it to Pembroke's study. They killed him, repositioned his body, and then, calmly, methodically, with a cloth wrapped around one finger, they wrote their message on the wall. Not in the victim's blood, which would have been the act of a frenzied mind, but in blood they had procured specifically for this purpose. He crossed to the mantelpiece and retrieved his pipe, filling it from the Persian slipper with absent-minded precision. This was not a crime of passion, Watson. This was a production, staged, costumed, scripted. And the letter to Scotland Yard, I said, the thought striking me with sudden force. The letter was written in blood as well. The same blood? Holmes lit his pipe and drew upon it with evident satisfaction. Almost certainly. The colour, the texture, the coagulation pattern of the dried blood on the letter Lestrade showed us are consistent with the wall sample. Both are porcine. Both show signs of storage and degradation. The letter was posted 3 days before the murder. The blood on the wall was applied the night of the murder. Both came from the same source. Blood obtained, I would estimate, approximately 5 days before the killing. He settled into his armchair across from me, wreathed in tobacco smoke, his eyes bright and hard. Think about what this tells us, Watson. The killer had a supply of blood, obtained days in advance. With that blood, they first wrote a letter to Scotland Yard, announcing the crime before it occurred. They posted that letter, timing it to arrive the morning after the murder. Then, on the night itself, they used the remaining blood to write the message on the wall. Every step was calculated. Every element was placed. The letter was Act 1, the announcement. The murder was Act 2, the deed. The message on the wall was Act 3, the declaration. And we, as I said before, are the audience. I was quiet for a long moment. My mind had been working, as it so often did in Holmes's company, along a parallel track. Less brilliant, perhaps, but not without its own logic. And that logic was pointing, with increasing insistence, toward a single name. "Reginald Pembroke," I said. Holmes raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "Consider it, Holmes. He has a key to the house. He could enter without force. He argued with his uncle 2 days before the murder, violently enough for the butler to hear. He has gambling debts that make the inheritance a matter of urgent necessity. His alibi at the club expires at 9:30, a full 45 minutes before the estimated time of death, and he is young, able-bodied, and intelligent enough to plan such a scheme." I leaned forward, warming to the theory. What if the argument 2 days before was not merely about money? Hargreaves said the word evidence was used repeatedly. What if Reginald discovered his uncle's secret, the corrupt prosecutions, the fabricated cases, and the argument was a confrontation, a threat, and when Pembroke refused to listen or threatened disinheritance, Reginald decided to act. He obtains the blood, writes the letter to create the impression of some external avenger, kills his uncle, and writes the message on the wall to complete the illusion. It accounts for everything, the planning, the timing, the access, the motive. I sat back, rather pleased with this construction. It was, I felt, both logical and comprehensive. It accounted for every element of the crime as we understood it, and it pointed toward a suspect who was, by any reasonable assessment, the most likely candidate. Holmes smoked in silence for a long moment. He did not look at me. He looked at the ceiling, his pipe sending thin blue ribbons of smoke toward the plaster, and his expression was one I could not easily read. Not disagreement exactly, but not agreement either. It was the expression of a man listening to a piece of music that is technically proficient but played in the wrong key. "You have constructed an admirable theory, Watson," he said at last. "It is logical. It is coherent. It accounts for the physical evidence, the timeline, and the known relationships between the parties. It is, in every respect, a theory that Scotland Yard would be proud to call its own." I waited. "And it accounts for everything," he continued, "except the most important detail." "Which is?" Holmes removed his pipe and fixed me with those grey, penetrating eyes. "Why would a nephew who expects to inherit his uncle's estate, an estate worth, by Lestrade's estimation, upwards of £20,000, deliberately draw police attention to his uncle's darkest professional secrets?" The question struck me like a cold draught. I opened my mouth, then closed it. "Consider, Watson. The letter to Scotland Yard reads, 'Pembroke will answer for what he buried.' The message on the wall reads, 'He knew the truth.' Both are designed to direct investigation toward Pembroke's past, toward his cases, toward whatever corruption lies buried in those files. Now, if Reginald is the killer, and his motive is inheritance, why would he do this? The exposure of Pembroke's fabricated evidence would be catastrophic. It would drag the family name through every newspaper in London. It would invite challenges to the estate from the families of wrongly convicted men. It would reduce the value of everything Reginald stands to inherit, and very possibly lead to civil actions that would consume the estate entirely." He leaned forward. "A killer motivated by greed conceals. A killer motivated by rage may leave chaos. But a killer who writes prophetic letters in blood and paints accusations on walls, that killer is motivated by something else entirely. Or that killer wants the world to know what Pembroke did, not to profit from his death, Watson, but to expose it, to drag the truth into the light, regardless of the consequences." He sat back. "That is not Reginald Pembroke. That is someone else. Someone for whom the exposure of the truth is not a risk, but the entire purpose of the act." I said nothing. The theory I'd built, so careful, so logical, so complete, had developed a crack, not in its evidence, but in its heart. Holmes had not challenged a single fact. He had challenged the motive, and motives, as he had taught me 100 times, were the architecture upon which every criminal act was built. "Then who?" I asked. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, looking out at the grey rooftops of London. "We must find who has recently purchased a quantity of pig's blood in this city. Smithfield Market is the obvious source. It is the largest meat market in London, and pig's blood is a common enough byproduct. A direct purchase would be unremarkable, but a purchase by someone who is not a butcher, not a cook, not a sausage maker, that would be noticed. That list, I suspect, will be short." He turned back to me, and the light from the window cast his profile in sharp relief against the fog beyond. "We are looking for someone patient, Watson, someone who plans weeks in advance, someone who obtained blood, stored it, composed a letter, timed its delivery, entered a house without force, killed without struggle, staged a scene with theatrical precision, and departed without leaving a trace." He paused. That is not the work of a gambler with debts and a temper. That is the work of someone who has been waiting and preparing for a very long time." He knocked his pipe against the grate and reached for his coat. "Where are we going?" I asked, rising. "To Smithfield," he said, "before the morning's trade washes the memory of last week's transactions away, and then back to Belgravia. There are questions I did not ask yesterday that I intend to ask today, and a room full of files that I have not yet examined." I retrieved my coat and hat. As I did, I glanced at the 2 vials still standing on the chemical table, one containing the blood of a pig, the other the blood of a man. 2 substances that looked identical to the naked eye, but were, in truth, as different as a lie from the truth it imitates. It occurred to me then, with a clarity that I would not fully appreciate until much later, that the entire case had the same quality. Everything in it looked like one thing and was, in fact, another. The body that appeared peaceful had been staged. The message that appeared to be the victim's dying declaration had been written by his killer. The letter that appeared to predict the future had been sent by the person who created that future. And somewhere in London, the author of this elaborate fiction was waiting. Not to flee, I sensed, but to see whether the story would be read as it was written. I followed Holmes down the stairs and out into the November fog, and I could not shake the feeling that we were not pursuing a criminal so much as following a script, one in which the final act had not yet been performed, none and whose ending the playwright had not yet chosen to reveal. Chapter 5. The Impossible Writing. I'd spent the better part of the previous evening constructing what I believed to be a persuasive case against Reginald Pembroke. I'd written it out in my notebook with considerable care. The gambling debts, the argument overheard by Hargreaves, the key to the house, the alibi that dissolved after 9:30, and now the revelation that the crime had been planned days in advance by someone organised enough to obtain pig's blood and post a letter to Scotland Yard with calculated timing. It was, I thought, a complete and logical framework. I was rather proud of it. Holmes, for his part, had said nothing to discourage me. He had listened to my theory over breakfast with an expression of polite attention, nodding at intervals, offering neither agreement nor objection. I took his silence for assent. It was not the first time I had made that particular error, and I confess it would not be the last. I should like to return to the study, Holmes announced, setting down his coffee cup with the abruptness that signalled a decision already made. There is something in that room I have not yet properly read. The message on the wall? The message, yes, but more precisely, the act of writing it. The blood tells us what was used, the wall tells us what was said. But the relationship between the two, the physical reality of a human being standing in that room and forming those letters, that is what I have not yet examined with sufficient rigour. We arrived at Pembroke House shortly before 10. Lestrade had arranged for us to have access to the study, though the body had been removed to the police mortuary the previous afternoon. The room was otherwise untouched. Holmes had insisted upon it, and Lestrade, whatever his reservations, had learned over the years that Holmes's insistences were worth honouring. The study, absent its occupant, felt different. The desk was bare, save for the blotter and the letter opener, which still sat in its brass stand like a monument to its own innocence. The green-shaded lamp was unlit. The bookshelves loomed in the grey November light that filtered through the tall windows, and behind the desk, on the dark wood panelling, the message remained. He knew the truth. The blood had dried to a deep brown, almost black at the thickest points of application. The letters were large. I confirmed Holmes's earlier estimate of approximately 8 inches in height, and formed with deliberate, even strokes. There was no dripping, no smearing, no sign of haste. Each character had been written by someone with a steady hand and sufficient light to see what they were doing. Holmes removed his coat, draped it over the back of a chair, and rolled up his shirt sleeves. From his pocket he produced a small measuring tape, which he extended between the floor and the lowest point of the first letter. He measured the height of each character. He measured the distance between words. He noted the angle at which the horizontal strokes had been drawn, and the direction of each vertical line. Then he did something I had not expected. He stood before the wall, raised his right hand, and mimed the act of writing. The highest point of the letter H, he said, stretching upward, is approximately 5 feet 9 inches from the floor. The lowest point of the final H in truth is 4 feet 2 inches. He lowered his arm and turned to me. Watson, you will recall that Arthur Pembroke was 6 feet and 1 inch tall. I measured him at the mortuary. Now, stand here, if you would. I obliged, positioning myself before the wall. raise your hand and place it at the top of that H. I did so. It was a comfortable reach. I am 5'9" myself. Now, imagine you have been stabbed beneath the left ribs. The blade has penetrated the thoracic cavity. Your left ventricle is punctured, or the aorta is torn. Internal hemorrhage is catastrophic. You have at most 30 seconds of consciousness, during which your blood pressure is collapsing and your motor function is deteriorating with every heartbeat. Could you stand? With difficulty, I admitted. Perhaps, for a few seconds, on pure adrenaline. Could you walk from that desk to this wall, a distance of 8 feet? It would be possible, but... Could you then raise your arm above your head and write 4 words in steady, even 8-inch letters, without dripping, without staggering, without leaving a single drop of blood on the carpet between the desk and the wall? I looked at the carpet. It was a deep burgundy Persian, well worn but well maintained. Between the desk and the wall there was not a single mark, not a drop, not a smear, not so much as a scuffed footprint. No, I said. No, it would be impossible. It would be more than impossible, Watson. It would be a medical miracle. A man with a penetrating cardiac wound cannot stand, walk 8 feet, raise both arms, for the breadth of these letters requires 2 hands, or at minimum a wide sweeping motion of 1, and write with the control and precision we see here. The pain alone would be incapacitating. The blood loss would impair motor function within seconds, and even if we grant the victim superhuman will, there is the matter of supply. He gestured to the wall. These 4 words required a considerable quantity of blood. The wound we examined produced almost no external bleeding. The blade was thin, the entry point narrow, and the hemorrhage was overwhelmingly internal. There is simply not enough blood available from that wound to produce this message. He stepped back from the wall and fixed me with a look of quiet certainty. The victim did not write this message, Watson. He could not have. The killer wrote it, and the killer wrote it with blood they brought to the scene, the same pig's blood we identified yesterday, obtained days in advance and stored in a sealed vessel. He paused, which means that the message was not a dying accusation. It was not the victim's last word to the world. It was the killer's opening statement, placed here, in this room, beside this body for us to find. I sat down in one of the chairs Holmes had drawn up during our previous visit. The implications were settling over me like a weight. The letter to Scotland Yard, posted 3 days before the murder, written in the same pig's blood. The message on the wall, written in the same pig's blood. The murder itself, committed with a weapon already present in the room, by someone the victim trusted enough to allow within arm's reach. Every element of this crime had been prepared. Every element had been placed. It was, as Holmes had said on our first visit, a performance. It was Reginald, I said, with a conviction that felt unassailable. He argued with his uncle 2 days before the murder. About evidence, Hargreaves said. He has gambling debts that make the inheritance urgent. He has a key to the house. His alibi fails after 9:30, and he is intelligent enough, the man was educated at Harrow, to plan something of this complexity. He obtained the pig's blood. He wrote the letter. He came to the house after leaving his club, killed his uncle, staged the scene, wrote the message, and departed. It accounts for everything. Holmes had been standing at the window, looking out at the grey street below. He did not turn around. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his fingers were working against each other in that restless, unconscious rhythm that meant his mind was operating at full speed. "You have constructed an admirable theory, Watson," he said. His voice was mild, almost gentle, and I felt a prickle of unease. Holmes was never gentle without cause. "It is logical. It is coherent. It accounts for the physical evidence and the timeline. Any jury in England would find it persuasive. Then you agree? He turned from the window. I said it was admirable. I did not say it was correct. He crossed to the desk and picked up the letter opener, turning it slowly in his fingers. Your theory accounts for everything except the most important detail. Which is why a nephew who expects to inherit would draw police attention to his uncle's darkest secrets. I opened my mouth to reply, and found that I could not. Holmes set down the letter opener and began to pace, that long, restless stride that carried him from the desk to the fireplace and back, his hands behind him, his chin lowered. Consider the letter, Watson. Pembroke will answer for what he buried. That is not a threat of violence. That is a promise of exposure. It directs Scotland Yard not toward a murder, but toward Pembroke's past, toward the cases he prosecuted, toward the things he buried. Now consider the message on the wall. He knew the truth. Again, not a boast by the killer, not a claim of vengeance. It is a declaration that Pembroke possessed knowledge that someone wanted brought to light. He stopped pacing and faced me. Every element of this crime is designed to expose the letter, the message, the theatrical staging of the body. It is all constructed to draw investigators into Pembroke's history, into the cases he built, the convictions he secured, the methods he employed. Now ask yourself, would Reginald Pembroke, sole heir to a £20,000 estate, a man whose family name is his only remaining asset, would such a man deliberately construct a crime that invites the world to examine his uncle's career for corruption? I said nothing. The logic was inescapable, and it dismantled my carefully built theory as cleanly as a surgeon's blade. If Reginald killed his uncle for the inheritance, Holmes continued, he would want the crime to look like a burglary, a random attack, an intruder. He would want the investigation to move outward, away from the family, away from the past. The last thing he would do is write a letter in blood to Scotland Yard announcing that Pembroke had secrets worth killing for. The last thing he would do is scrawl a message on the wall that practically begs investigators to examine every case the man ever prosecuted. He returned to the window and stood with his back to me, watching the street. The killer's objective is not concealment, Watson. It is revelation. This crime was committed not to hide the truth, but to guarantee that the truth would be found. Yet the murder is the match, the staging, the letter, the message, the theatricality of the body's arrangement. That is the fire. Someone killed Arthur Pembroke because they wanted the world to know what he had done, and they designed every element of this scene to ensure that the investigation would uncover it. The room was very quiet. The November light lay flat and grey across the carpet, and the message on the wall seemed to darken as the afternoon dimmed. "Then who?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. He remained at the window, his silhouette sharp against the pale glass, and I had the strange impression that he was not looking at the street at all, but at something far more distant, a pattern assembling itself behind his eyes, piece by piece, like the mechanism of a clock being fitted together in the dark. Someone with patience, he said at last. Extraordinary patience. Someone who planned this not over days or weeks, but over years. Someone for whom Arthur Pembroke was not merely a man to be killed, but a wrong to be righted. Someone whose entire purpose, whose entire life perhaps, has been building toward this room, this body, this message. He turned from the window. We must examine Pembroke's case files, Watson. Every prosecution, every conviction. The answer is not in this room. It is in his past. And whatever Pembroke buried, someone has spent a very long time digging it up. He collected his coat from the chair and drew it on with sharp, economical movements. At the door, he paused and looked back at the study, at the desk where a dead man had sat in state, us at the wall where 4 words still glistened darkly in the fading light. A message that arrives before the crime is a stage direction, he murmured, repeating his pronouncement from that first morning at Baker Street. And a message written on the wall of the dead man's study. That is the program notes. We are being told what this play is about. All that remains is to discover who is holding the pen. We descended the stairs in silence. In the entrance hall below, I caught a brief glimpse of movement at the far end of the service passage. A figure in dark blue, moving with quiet efficiency, carrying a stack of papers from one room to another. Miss Ward, I assumed, the secretary, going about what remained of her duties with the same steady discipline I had observed in her at our first visit. I thought nothing of it. There was no reason to. Holmes, walking ahead of me toward the front door, did not look in her direction. But as we stepped out into the cold, he said, so quietly that I almost missed it beneath the rattle of a passing carriage, "The person we are looking for, Watson, is someone who has been invisible for a very long time. Someone who has stood in a room full of people and been seen by none of them. Remember that." I did not understand him then. I would, later, wish that I had. Chapter 6. The Case Buried in Silence. The following morning, Holmes dispatched a telegram to Lestrade requesting the key to Pembroke's private legal archive, a locked mahogany cabinet in the corner of the study that we had noted but not yet examined. Lestrade's reply came within the hour, accompanied by the key itself, delivered by a young constable who looked as though he had been running. "Lestrade is reluctant," Holmes observed, turning the key in his fingers, "but cooperative. He senses, I think, that this case is moving beyond the comfortable territory of alibis and motives into something he would rather not navigate alone. We arrived at Pembroke House before noon. The household had taken on the subdued, drifting quality of a ship without a captain. The cook, Mrs. Price, admitted us with red-rimmed eyes and retreated immediately to the kitchen. Hargreaves met us in the entrance hall with his customary rigid formality, though I noticed the tremor in his hands had not improved. He led us upstairs without a word. The study had been sealed since our last visit. The message on the wall remained. He knew the truth, and the green-shaded lamp on the desk cast a weak pool of light across the empty chair where Pembroke had sat. Holmes paid neither the wall nor the desk any attention. He crossed directly to the mahogany cabinet in the far corner, inserted Lestrade's key and turned it. The cabinet was impressive in its organization. 4 deep shelves, each containing a row of files arranged alphabetically by surname and subdivided chronologically by year. Every file bore a handwritten label in the same precise copper plate, Pembroke's own hand, I assumed, or perhaps his secretary's. The cases spanned 3 decades, from the late 1860s to the mid-1890s, and represented the full scope of a Crown prosecutor's career. Murders, frauds, conspiracies, thefts, assaults, forgeries. Dozens of lives reduced to bundles of paper and bound in brown card. Holmes began at the most recent files and worked backward. He did not read each one, there was not time for that, but he examined the spines, checked the labels, and occasionally withdrew a file to glance at its contents before replacing it. I occupied myself with the earlier years, working forward from the 1860s, though I confess I was not entirely certain what I was looking for. It was Holmes who found it, or rather, Holmes who found the absence of it. He had reached the section corresponding to 1878. The files were arranged in their usual order: Barton, Colley, Dunning, Farnham. And then there was a gap, not a large one. The width of a single file, perhaps 3/4 of an inch. The adjacent files stood upright and undisturbed. Their spines flush against the shelf. But between Dunning and Farnham, where a file should have been, there was nothing but a narrow stripe of bare wood. Holmes stared at that gap for a long time. "Watson," he said, "come here." I crossed to the cabinet. He indicated the space with one long finger. "Every file in this cabinet is present. Every case Arthur Pembroke prosecuted over 30 years of public service is accounted for, labelled and filed in its proper position. Except one. He touched the files on either side of the gap. Dunning, a fraud case, 1877. Farnham, an assault, 1878. Between them, alphabetically, we should find a surname beginning with E through Far. The gap is clean. No torn edges, no displaced papers, no dust disturbance on the shelf. The file was removed carefully, deliberately, and recently. Could Pembroke have removed it himself? Possible, but inconsistent with everything we know about his character. This cabinet is a monument to his career. Every conviction, every victory, preserved, organised, accessible. A man who maintains an archive with this degree of care does not casually extract a file and fail to return it. No, someone took this file, and they took only this one. He closed the cabinet and locked it. Then he sat down at Pembroke's desk, in the dead man's own chair, and pressed his fingertips together. We need to know what case occupied that gap. The year is 1878. The surname falls between Dunning and Farnham. The public record should tell us the rest. We spent the remainder of the afternoon at the Old Bailey. The archives there were not so handsome as Pembroke's private collection. They were housed in a basement that smelled of dust and damp paper, presided over by a clerk so elderly that he seemed to have accrued the same patina as the documents in his charge. But the records were thorough, and after 2 hours of systematic searching, Holmes found what he was looking for. Daniel Ward, he said, lifting a thin sheaf of newspaper cuttings from a folder of press clippings, related to the 1878 Michaelmas sessions. Convicted of the murder of George Fenton, a warehouse overseer at the Royal Victoria Dock. Prosecuted by Arthur Pembroke. Sentenced to life imprisonment. He spread the cuttings on the clerk's desk. The largest was from the Daily Telegraph, dated October 1878, and bore the headline, "Dock Worker Convicted of Brutal Murder. Prosecutor Pembroke Secures Decisive Verdict." The article was brief and workmanlike. Daniel Ward, aged 29, a labourer employed at the Royal Victoria Dock, had been found guilty of murdering George Fenton following a dispute. The prosecution had presented testimony from a dockside witness, a man named Greeley, who claimed to have seen Ward strike Fenton with a cargo hook. The defence had been weak. The verdict was unanimous. A smaller cutting from a local Newham paper added a detail the Telegraph had omitted. Ward had maintained his innocence throughout the trial, claiming that another man, a known smuggler, had been responsible. The magistrate had dismissed this as fabrication. Pembroke's first major prosecution, Holmes murmured, scanning the cuttings. The career maker, a young prosecutor, eager to close a headline case, secures a conviction against a dock worker on the strength of a single witness. He set the cuttings down. Daniel Ward was sentenced to life. He died in Pentonville Prison in 1883, tuberculosis. Good Lord, I said. 5 years. 5 years for a crime he may not have committed. Note the defence's claim another man was responsible, a smuggler. That claim was dismissed, but it was made. And note the prosecution's reliance on a single witness, Greeley, a dockside informant, the kind of man whose testimony is available for the right price. Holmes gathered the cuttings and returned them to the folder with the care of a man handling evidence. This was the file that was taken from Pembroke's cabinet, Watson. Not a fraud, not a forgery, not a case of recent significance. A murder conviction from 23 years ago. The question is, why does it matter now? And why did someone want it removed? I did not have an answer, but as we left the Old Bailey and emerged into the late afternoon gloom, I found myself thinking of the message on the wall. He knew the truth, and wondering whether it referred not to something Pembroke had discovered, but to something he had done. we returned to Pembroke House one final time that evening. Holmes wished to examine the cabinet once more, and to ask Hargreaves certain questions about the household's access to the study. But it was not Hargreaves who occupied my attention upon our arrival. It was Emily Ward. She was in the drawing-room adjacent to the study, seated at a small writing desk, and sorting through a stack of correspondence with the quiet efficiency I'd come to expect from her. She rose as we entered and offered a brief, respectful nod. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Mr. Hargreaves is in the butler's pantry. Shall I fetch him?" "In a moment, Miss Ward," said Holmes. He had paused in the doorway, and I saw that his eyes had moved, not to her face, but to the papers she was sorting. "You are managing Mr. Pembroke's correspondence?" "What remains of it, sir? There are letters of condolence to acknowledge, and several outstanding matters of business that will need to be referred to Mr. Pembroke's solicitor. I thought it best to organise them before the household is—" She hesitated, and for the first time I saw something flicker across her composure. Not grief exactly, but an awareness of impermanence. "Before the household is dissolved." "Very conscientious," Holmes said. "Tell me, Miss Ward, in your 3 years as Mr. Pembroke's secretary, did you ever have occasion to access his private legal cabinet? The locked one in the study?" "No, sir. Mr. Pembroke kept that cabinet locked at all times. He carried the key on his person." "And you never saw him remove files from it? Or return files to it?" "He consulted it occasionally. Perhaps once a month. He would unlock it, review a file, and lock it again. I was never present when he did so. He preferred to work alone in those moments." "Did he ever mention the name Daniel Ward?" The question was delivered with the same mild, conversational tone Holmes had used throughout. But I was watching Emily Ward's face, and I saw it. A pause, not in her expression, which remained composed and attentive, but in her hand. Her right hand, which had been resting lightly on the stack of correspondence, stopped. The fingers, which had been idly aligned along the edge of the topmost letter, went still, frozen in place for perhaps half a second, perhaps less. Then they resumed their position, and she looked up at Holmes with clear, steady eyes. "No, sir, I don't believe so. The name is not familiar to me." "Thank you, Miss Ward. That will be all for the moment." She inclined her head and returned to her work. Holmes watched her for a moment, then turned and walked toward the study. I followed. I should note here that I observed the hesitation of her hand. I saw it. I recorded it in the way that a physician records a symptom without yet knowing the diagnosis. But I assigned it no particular significance. She had been asked an unexpected question about a name she did not recognize. A moment's pause was natural. I thought nothing more of it. I have often reflected, in the months since, on how much of the truth I held in my hand at that moment, and did not recognize. The composed young woman at the writing desk, the missing file from 1878, the name Daniel Ward spoken aloud in a room where it had not been heard for 23 years. The pieces were all before me. I simply could not see the picture they formed. Holmes, I believe, was beginning to. We found Hargreaves in the butler's pantry, polishing silver with the mechanical devotion of a man who has no other way to occupy his terror. Holmes questioned him briefly about access to the study, who held keys, who entered and when, asked whether the private cabinet had ever been opened in his presence. Hargreaves answered precisely and without elaboration. The study was accessible to himself, Miss Ward, and Mr. Pembroke. The cabinet key was kept on Pembroke's watch chain. No one else, to Hargreaves's knowledge, had ever opened it. As we descended the stairs to leave, Holmes stopped on the landing. Below us, the entrance hall was empty. From somewhere deep in the house came the faint sound of Mrs. Price weeping, a thin, exhausted sound, like a kettle that has boiled itself dry. "Watson," Holmes said, "I have several threads to follow this evening. I may be gone for some time." "Where are you going?" "Several places. Camberwell, for one. The Old Bailey archives require a second visit. There are records I did not examine today. And I have a question for a butcher in Smithfield that I should like answered before morning." He pulled on his gloves with the brisk efficiency of a man who has already departed in his mind. "Do not wait up." "Holmes, review your notes, Watson. Everything we have gathered thus far, the letter, the blood, the wound, the staging, the missing file, the name Daniel Ward. There is a thread connecting all of it, and I am not yet certain where it leads, but I can feel it tightening." He descended the remaining stairs, crossed the hall, and was gone into the November darkness without looking back. I stood alone on the landing of a dead man's house, listening to the grandfather clock measure out its indifferent seconds, and felt, not for the first time in my long association with Holmes, that I was seeing only the surface of something whose depths he had already begun to fathom. I returned to Baker Street and did as he had asked. I reviewed my notes. I read them twice, then a third time, and with each reading my conviction regarding Reginald Pembroke grew stronger. The debts, the argument, the key, the alibi gap, the intelligence to plan. It had to be Reginald. Every logical pathway led to him. I went to bed that night certain I knew who had killed Arthur Pembroke. I was, of course, entirely wrong. Holmes did not return that night, nor the following morning. I breakfasted alone, read the papers. The Pembroke case had now consumed the front pages entirely, with feverish speculation about blood cults and secret societies, and waited. It was not until late the following afternoon, nearly 18 hours after his departure, that I heard his familiar tread upon the stair. He entered the sitting room, looking as though he had passed those 18 hours in the company of London's least reputable citizens. His boots were caked with a heavy yellow mud. His cuffs bore smudges of coal dust. And clinging to his coat, unmistakably, was the sharp, sour smell of cheap gin. He said nothing. He crossed to his armchair, dropped into it, and closed his eyes. I poured him a brandy without being asked. He took it, drank half, and set the glass down. "You have been to Camberwell," I said, noting the mud, "and somewhere near a railway line, by the coal dust, and a public house, obviously." "Obvious to you, Watson, is often the boundary where interesting things begin." He opened his eyes and looked at me, and I was struck by something I had not seen before in the course of this investigation. He did not look triumphant. He did not look energized. He looked, if anything, sad. "I have learned a great deal in the past 18 hours, he said, "and very little of it brings me any satisfaction." He would say no more that evening, but the investigation I sensed had turned a corner. Whatever Holmes had found in the back streets of Camberwell, in the dusty vaults of the Old Bailey, and in the blood-slick stalls of Smithfield Market, it had changed the shape of the case entirely. I did not yet know how, but the answer, when it came, would prove to be one of the most remarkable and most deeply troubling that Holmes and I ever encountered together. Chapter 7. The Position of the Body. Holmes did not speak again that evening. He sat in his armchair with the brandy untouched beside him, his eyes half closed, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that attitude of intense concentration that I had long since learned not to interrupt. I retired early and slept fitfully, troubled by dreams of blood-written letters and empty shelves. When I came down the following morning, Holmes was already dressed. Clean collar, fresh coat, the mud and coal dust of his nocturnal expedition replaced by his usual sharp precision. He was standing at the mantelpiece, filling his pipe from the Persian slipper, and he turned to me with an expression that was not quite energy and not quite resignation, but something uncomfortably between the two. "Sit down, Watson. I have a great deal to tell you." And very little of it is pleasant. I sat. He lit his pipe, drew on it twice, and began. "I went first to Camberwell, to the home of a retired Scotland Yard inspector named Aloysius Brannigan." He watched my face for recognition, and found none. Brannigan led the investigation into the murder of George Fenton in 1878, the case that resulted in Daniel Ward's conviction. He worked alongside Pembroke. He presented the prosecution's evidence to the magistrate. If Pembroke fabricated testimony to secure that conviction, Brannigan either participated or looked the other way. And which was it? Holmes drew on his pipe. The latter. I found Brannigan in a terraced house that has not seen paint in a decade. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture was worn through to the stuffing, and the man himself. Holmes paused, and I saw something pass across his features that might, in a less guarded man, have been pity. Brannigan is a ruin, Watson, unshaven, trembling hands, the smell of gin so deep in the fabric of his clothing that no amount of washing could remove it. He has been drinking himself to death for years, and he is nearly finished. Did he confess to involvement? He confessed to knowledge. He told me, with the particular eagerness of a man who has carried a secret too long, that he knew the Daniel Ward conviction was not sound. He did not fabricate evidence himself. That was Pembroke's work. But Brannigan presented testimony to the court that he suspected was manufactured. A dockside informant named Greeley paid for his cooperation, and a witness statement from a man named Clough that placed another suspect at the scene. Brannigan saw that statement. Pembroke suppressed it. Brannigan said nothing. Good God. Brannigan has lived with this for 23 years. He visited Pembroke 6 weeks before the murder, begging him to leave the past undisturbed. He is consumed by guilt, Watson, but he is not consumed by purpose. That man has neither the will, the planning capacity, nor the nerve to commit a murder of this complexity. He has been dying by inches since the day he retired. He did not need to kill Pembroke. Holmes tapped the stem of his pipe against his palm. Pembroke's ghost already killed him. I absorbed this in silence. Then, you said you went to several places. The Old Bailey again? Yes. I examined the full trial record of the Ward case. The details confirm what Brannigan told me. The prosecution rested almost entirely on Greeley's testimony. The defence was underfunded and ineffective. Daniel Ward's claim that a smuggler named Thomas Briggs had killed Fenton was dismissed without investigation. Briggs, as it happens, fled to America shortly after the murder. He was never pursued. Holmes crossed to the window and stood with his back to me, looking out at the grey morning. And then I went to Smithfield. The meat market. I wished to know whether a quantity of pig's blood had been purchased recently, within the past week, by someone whose description might be of interest. I spoke with 11 butchers before I found the right one. A man named Crabbe, operating from a stall near the Grand Avenue. 5 days before the murder, a young woman purchased a jar of fresh pig's blood. She paid cash. She wore a plain bonnet and a simple dress. Nothing remarkable, nothing memorable. Crabbe remembered her only because the request was unusual. He asked what it was for. She said it was for a recipe her mistress required. He turned from the window. A young woman, Watson, not a man, not Reginald Pembroke. I opened my mouth and closed it again. My theory, my careful, logical, complete theory, shifted beneath me like sand. There is more, Holmes said. He sat down opposite me and leaned forward. While pursuing the Daniel Ward case through the public record, I also investigated the other names connected to Pembroke's prosecutorial career, including one Margaret Hollis. The name was unfamiliar to me, Holmes explained. Margaret Hollis, age 44, was the widow of James Hollis, convicted of fraud in 1882 in a case prosecuted by Pembroke. James had received 8 years and died of pneumonia in Dartmoor after 4. Margaret had spent the years since campaigning publicly for her husband's exoneration, writing letters to the Home Office, to newspapers, to Pembroke himself. She had been seen outside Pembroke House 3 times in the week before the murder. She was in the Belgravia area on the night of the killing, visiting a friend on Eaton Square, and had no alibi for the critical hour between 10 and past. "She sounds," I began. "She sounds like a suspect." "She is not." Holmes's voice was flat. "I visited Margaret Hollis yesterday evening. She's passionate and articulate and burning with a grief that has not diminished in nearly 20 years. But in the course of our conversation, she revealed, without intending to, that she found her husband's private ledgers after his death. Ledgers that confirm, beyond any reasonable doubt, that James Hollis committed the fraud Pembroke prosecuted him for." I stared at him. "Her husband was guilty." "Her husband was guilty. Margaret knows it. She has known it for years. Her entire campaign, the letters, the petitions, the visits to Pembroke House, is built upon a lie she tells herself, because the alternative is unbearable. She came to Pembroke's door not to kill him, but to confront him, to make him feel something, to extract from him some acknowledgement of her suffering. She never found the courage to ring the bell." He paused. "She is not our killer, Watson. She is a woman pursuing a ghost." Holmes then rose and informed me that he wished to make 2 final inquiries before the day was out. The first was to Pembroke House, to speak with Hargreaves. The second was to the police mortuary, to examine the body one final time. I accompanied him to both. The confrontation with Hargreaves was brief and devastating. Holmes had learned, through what channels I could not determine, that the butler had been secretly copying pages from Pembroke's private files for the past year. He presented this fact to Hargreaves without preamble, standing in the butler's small, orderly room while the old man's face drained of what little colour remained. Hargreaves broke, not violently, not dramatically, but with the quiet collapse of a structure that has been bearing weight too long. He sank into his chair and pressed his hands to his face, and when he spoke, his voice was thin and shaking. He had copied the files as insurance, he said, not blackmail. He had served Pembroke for 22 years, and in that time had seen things. Late-night visitors, whispered conversations, files burned in the study fireplace. He did not know the specifics of Pembroke's corruption, but he sensed it. He feared that when the truth eventually surfaced, the household would be investigated, and he would be implicated. The copied documents were his proof of innocence, evidence that he was a servant, not a co-conspirator. Holmes listened without interruption. When Hargreaves finished, Holmes asked a single question. "Did you kill Arthur Pembroke?" Hargreaves looked up with an expression of such bewildered horror that no actor on earth could have counterfeited it. "Kill him? Mr. Holmes, I served him for 22 years. I polished his silver. I brought him his tea every morning at 7:15. I may have feared him, sir, but I did not kill him. I could not. I haven't the stomach for it, and I haven't the heart." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then nodded once and left the room without another word. At the mortuary, Holmes spent 40 minutes with the body while I waited in the corridor. When he emerged, his expression was set in the particular arrangement of features I had come to associate with certainty. Not triumph, but the grim satisfaction of a theory confirmed. "The wound was made from close range," he said as we walked out into the cold, "by someone standing before the victim while he sat at his desk. The angle of entry is slightly upward, consistent with an assailant shorter than Pembroke, who was 6'1". No defensive wounds, no bruising, no sign whatsoever that Pembroke perceived a threat. He was killed by someone he trusted completely, someone he expected to see in that room, at that hour, approaching his desk." He stopped walking. We stood on the pavement outside the mortuary and the November wind cut through my coat. "I have now spoken to every person connected to this case," he said. "Each one has a secret. Reginald hides his gambling debts and his knowledge of his uncle's corruption. Hargreaves hides his copied files. Margaret Hollis hides her husband's guilt. Brannigan hides his complicity. Each of them carries something concealed, something shameful, something they fear being discovered. He turned to me. Only one person in this household has shown me nothing to hide. Miss Emily Ward. No secrets, no evasions, no fear, no confusion, no self-interest. She has answered every question with composure and precision. She has presented herself as an open book, a competent young woman, grateful for stable employment, dutifully managing the affairs of a dead man's household. His grey eyes were very steady, and that, Watson, is the most suspicious thing of all. Everyone in a murdered man's household should have something to hide. The absence of a secret is itself the deepest secret. Innocence does not look like this. Innocence is messy, I protested. I could not help it. Holmes. She is a secretary. A young woman in service. She has no connection to any of this. No motive, no history with Pembroke beyond 3 years of employment. Then why did her hand stop when I said the name Daniel Ward? The words fell between us like a stone into still water. I remembered it. The drawing room at Pembroke House, the stack of correspondence, Emily Ward's fingers pausing for a fraction of a second on the page. I had seen it, I had recorded it, and I had dismissed it as nothing. Holmes watched me arrive at this realization and said nothing more. He hailed a cab and we rode back to Baker Street in silence. But the silence was different now. It was not the contemplative quiet of an investigation in progress. It was the taut, uncharged stillness of a man who knows the answer and is measuring the distance between knowledge and proof. I sat beside him and felt the case shifting beneath me. All my careful theories, my logical constructions, my certainty about Reginald Pembroke, dissolving like fog in the path of something I had not seen coming. Someone invisible, someone patient, someone who had stood in a room full of people and been seen by none of them. Holmes's words from 2 days ago returned to me, and for the first time I understood what he had meant. Chapter 8. The Illusion of a Story. Holmes spent the following morning in a state of focused, almost ceremonial preparation. He wrote 3 telegrams before breakfast, dispatched them via the page boy, and received replies to 2 of them before noon. He consulted a small leather notebook I had never seen before, filled with entries in his own cramped hand. He polished the 2 glass vials, the blood samples from the study, and placed them in a velvet-lined case alongside a small bottle of chemical reagent that I recognized from his experiments the previous week, and he dressed with particular care, choosing a dark frock coat and a grey silk cravat that he reserved for occasions of professional gravity. "We are going to Pembroke House," he announced at 1:30. "I have asked Lestrade to assemble the household, along with Reginald Pembroke. I should like you to bring your notebook, Watson, and your revolver, though I do not anticipate needing it." "You know who killed him," I said. It was not a question. I have known since yesterday evening. What I lacked was proof. "The telegrams this morning have supplied it." He took up his hat and his stick. "Come, it is time to close the curtain on this particular theatre." We arrived at Pembroke House at 2:00. Lestrade was already there, standing in the entrance hall with the uncomfortable expression of a man who has been summoned without being told why. Reginald Pembroke sat in the drawing-room, pale and drawn, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. Hargreaves stood at the foot of the stairs, rigid as a post. Mrs. Price hovered near the kitchen passage, clutching a handkerchief, and Emily Ward was seated at the small writing desk where I had seen her last, her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of calm attentiveness. Holmes led us all into the study. The message on the wall had been scrubbed but remained faintly visible, a ghost of words beneath the dark panelling. Holmes had arranged chairs in a semicircle facing the desk, and he took his position behind it, standing where Pembroke had sat. The effect was deliberate and unmistakable. He had transformed the study into a courtroom, and he was the presiding authority. "Thank you all for coming," he said, and his voice carried the quiet, absolute command that I had heard from him only in the final acts of his most significant cases. "I shall not waste your time. I know who killed Arthur Pembroke. I know how it was done. I know why, and I shall demonstrate each of these in turn." He opened the velvet case and withdrew the 2 glass vials, holding them up so the grey afternoon light caught them. One was dark, almost black. The other was a deep, dull red. 2 samples of blood, one taken from the message on the wall of this room, the other from the wound on Arthur Pembroke's body. He set them on the desk side by side. Inspector Lestrade and the rest of you may assume these are the same substance. They are not. From the case he produced the reagent bottle and a small glass dish. He uncorked the first vial, the wool sample, and allowed 3 drops to fall into the dish. Then he added a measure of the reagent. The blood darkened, thickened, and produced a faintly granular texture that was visible even from where I sat. He repeated the process with the second vial. The wound blood reacted differently. It remained smooth, its colour shifting only slightly, its consistency unchanged. "The blood on the wall," Holmes said, "is not human. It is the blood of a pig, obtained before the murder, stored in a sealed vessel, and brought to this room by the killer. The blood from the wound is human, Arthur Pembroke's own. These are 2 different substances from 2 different sources." He paused and let the silence do its work. Mrs. Price had gone white. Reginald was staring at the vials. Hargreaves had not moved. Emily Ward sat perfectly still. The message on this wall was not written by a dying man. It was written by the person who killed him, using materials they had prepared in advance. He set the vials aside and produced, from his coat pocket, the evidence case containing the letter that had started everything, the blood-written message to Scotland Yard. He laid it on the desk beside the vials. This letter was posted 3 days before the murder. It is written in the same pig's blood. I've confirmed this through identical chemical analysis. The same hand, the same substance, the same source. He straightened and addressed the room with the measured cadence of a barrister delivering a closing argument. The killer did not simply commit a crime. They designed a narrative. This letter was the first act, a promise of reckoning sent to Scotland Yard, timed to arrive on the morning the body would be discovered. The murder was the second act. The message on the wall was the third. Every element was placed. Every timing was calculated. We, the police, the press, the public, we are the audience. And the story we were meant to follow leads not to the killer, but to the victim's past. He moved to the mahogany cabinet in the corner. He unlocked it, opened the doors, X and indicated the gap on the shelf, the narrow absence between Dunning and Farnham. 1 file is missing from this archive. 1 case, out of 30 years of prosecutions. The Daniel Ward case, 1878. A dock worker convicted of murder on the testimony of a paid informant, prosecuted by Arthur Pembroke in what was his first major case. Daniel Ward maintained his innocence. He died of tuberculosis in Pentonville Prison 5 years later. Holmes closed the cabinet. The killer did not rob this house. They did not take valuables or money or documents of general interest. They took 1 file, 1 truth, from 23 years ago. He turned to Reginald. "Mr. Pembroke, where were you between 9:45 and 10:30 on the night of the murder?" Reginald's face flushed, then drained. His mouth opened and closed, and the silence stretched. "You were with Mr. Stokes," Holmes said, "the moneylender, in a public house in Soho. You went there directly from your club to beg for an extension on your debts. The meeting lasted from 9:45 until 10:30. I have confirmed this independently. Mr. Stokes was reluctant to speak, but I can be persuasive when the occasion demands." Reginald slumped in his chair. The relief and the shame fought each other across his features, and relief won. "Yes," he whispered. Yes, that is where I was. I felt the ground shift beneath me. My theory, the theory I had built with such care, such conviction across the span of this investigation, collapsed in the space of a single sentence. Reginald had been nowhere near Pembroke House at the time of the murder. He could not have done it. Every piece of evidence I had assembled, every logical connection I had drawn, fell away like scaffolding from a finished wall, revealing a structure I did not recognize. Holmes did not look at me. He did not need to. The killer was in this house that night, he continued, his voice steady and unhurried. The victim trusted them. He allowed them to approach his desk without alarm. He did not stand. He did not raise his hands. The killer knew this house, the rooms, the routines, the habits of every member of the household. They had time to kill, to reposition the body, to button the waistcoat over the wound, to write the message on the wall, to clean the weapon and replace it on the desk, and to remove the Daniel Ward file from a locked cabinet. They did all of this in minutes. Not because they were hurried, but because they had rehearsed. He turned to Mrs. Price. The cook flinched. Mrs. Price, you told me that on the night of the murder you left the kitchen at approximately 10 o'clock to check the front door lock. Your nightly routine, how long were you away? 5 minutes, sir. Perhaps 6 or 7. No more. And who was with you in the kitchen that evening? Miss Ward, sir. She came down at 9:30. We had tea together. And when you returned from checking the door, was Miss Ward still in the kitchen? Mrs. Price hesitated. It was a small hesitation, the kind that arises not from deception, but from the dawning awareness that a familiar fact has acquired an unfamiliar weight. Yes, sir. She was sitting just where I had left her. Her teacup was in her hand. Holmes nodded. Then he turned to Emily Ward. The room turned with him. Every eye followed his gaze to the young woman seated at the end of the semicircle, her hands still folded in her lap, her posture unchanged since we had entered the room. She looked up at Holmes with an expression of quiet attention, as though he were about to ask her to fetch a file or post a letter. Miss Ward, Holmes said, 2 days ago, in this room, I spoke the name Daniel Ward. You were sorting correspondence at that desk. Your hand stopped. For less than a second, but it stopped. You knew that name before I said it. She did not speak. Daniel Ward was convicted of murder in 1878 on evidence fabricated by Arthur Pembroke. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in Pentonville Prison in 1883 of tuberculosis. He was 29 years old when he was arrested. Holmes paused. He left behind a wife who died 2 years after him, and he left behind a daughter, a girl of 2, who would never know her father outside of a prison visiting room. The study was absolutely silent. The grandfather clock in the hall below had stopped, or perhaps I had simply ceased to hear it. That daughter would be 27 years old today, Holmes said. She would have been raised by a relative, an aunt perhaps. She would have learned the truth of her father's conviction when she was old enough to bear it. And if she were a woman of intelligence, of patience, of extraordinary discipline, she might have spent years preparing, educating herself, cultivating references, working her way into the household of the man who destroyed her father, waiting 3 years in his service, 3 years managing his correspondence, his calendar, his files, 3 years with access to everything, including a locked cabinet whose key hung on a dead man's watch chain. He looked at Emily Ward, and in her expression I saw something I had not expected, something that would remain with me for the rest of my life. It was not surprise. It was not fear. It was not the cornered desperation of a criminal unmasked. It was relief. The composure that had defined her from the first moment I saw her, that preternatural stillness, that discipline I had mistaken for professionalism, did not shatter. It changed. The mask did not fall. It simply became transparent, and behind it I saw the face of a woman who had been holding her breath for a very long time and had at last been given permission to exhale. She looked at Holmes, and Holmes looked at her, and for a moment the room and everyone in it ceased to exist. It was only the two of them, the detective who had dismantled her perfect crime, and the woman who had built it not to escape but to be found. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady, clear, almost gentle. "My name is Emily Ward. My father was Daniel Ward, and I have been waiting for someone to say his name in this house for 3 years." Chapter 9. Emily Ward's Confession. No one moved. The silence in the study was of the kind I had encountered only twice before in my life. Once on a battlefield, in the seconds after a bombardment ceased, and once in a church, at the moment a coffin was lowered into the ground. It was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something that sound could not contain. Emily Ward sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at each of us in turn, at Mrs. Price, whose handkerchief was pressed to her mouth, at Hargreaves, whose rigid composure had cracked at last, leaving him grey and stricken, at Reginald, who stared at her as though she had materialized from thin air, at Lestrade, whose notebook hung forgotten in his hand, and then at Holmes, who stood behind the desk with his arms at his sides and waited. "I should like to tell you about my father," she said. Her voice was steady. It carried no tremor, no plea, no theatrical inflection. It was the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this moment not for performance but for precision, who had known, perhaps from the very beginning, that it would end here, in this room, with these words. His name was Daniel Ward. He was a dock worker at the Royal Victoria. He loaded cargo 6 days a week and came home smelling of salt and timber and river mud. He was not an educated man. He could read, but slowly, and his handwriting was like a child's, large and careful, every letter formed with concentration. But he read to me at night, every night. He would sit on the edge of my bed with a book open on his knee, and he would read until I fell asleep. I was 2 years old when they took him. I do not remember his voice. I remember the weight of him sitting on the bed. I remember the smell of the river on his coat. That is all. She paused. Her gaze had drifted to the window, where the November light lay grey and cold against the glass. When she continued, her eyes returned to Holmes. "I saw him 4 times in prison. My mother took me. Pentonville is not a place for children, but my mother insisted. She said he needed to see my face. I remember a room with a glass partition and a man behind it who was thinner each time. He smiled at me. He told me to be good. The last time I saw him, I was 7. His face was the colour of candle wax, and he coughed into a cloth that came away spotted with red. He died that winter. Tuberculosis. 5 years into a life sentence for a murder he did not commit." Mrs. Price made a small, strangled sound. Emily did not look at her. "My mother lasted 2 more years. After the conviction, no one would employ her. The wife of a murderer. She took in washing until her hands bled. She sold everything we owned except my father's coat, which she kept folded in a trunk at the foot of her bed. She fell ill in the winter of 1884 and did not recover. I was 10 years old. My aunt, my mother's sister, took me in. She raised me. She fed me. She told me when I turned 18 the truth." Emily's hands, still folded in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. It was the first sign of emotion I'd seen from her. Not in her face, not in her voice, but in the whitening of her knuckles. "My aunt told me that a man named Thomas Briggs had killed George Fenton. Briggs was a smuggler. Fenton had been threatening to expose him. They quarrelled at the docks, and Briggs struck him down. My father and Fenton had argued that same week over unpaid wages, publicly, in front of witnesses. It was enough. When Briggs fled to America, my father was the convenient answer. She looked directly at the space where Pembroke had sat, the empty chair behind the desk where Holmes now stood. Arthur Pembroke was a young prosecutor, ambitious. The Fenton murder was his first major case. He needed a conviction. My father was a dock worker with no money, no connections, and no solicitor worth the name. Pembroke found a man called Greeley, a dockside informant, a man who would say anything for the right price, and paid him to testify that he had seen my father strike Fenton. There was another witness, a man named Clough, who had seen Briggs at the docks that night. Pembroke suppressed his statement. It never reached the court. Holmes spoke for the first time since Emily had begun. "You found the file?" "I found the file. It took me 3 years. Mr. Pembroke kept his cabinet locked and the key on his watch chain. But keys are not the only way into a lock, Mr. Holmes. I learned patience before I learned anything else. I waited for a night when he left the key in his study. It happened twice in 3 years, both times when he had taken more brandy than usual. The second time, I opened the cabinet. I found the file. I read every page." Her voice did not waver. Greeley's testimony was in there, annotated in Pembroke's own hand, with notes on what Greeley should say and how much he was to be paid. And Clough's statement, the statement that would have freed my father, was folded at the bottom, unsigned, unseen, buried for 23 years. The room was very still. I did not decide to kill him that night. I had decided long before. But reading that file, holding in my hands the proof of what had been done to my father, that was the night I set the date. She described the preparation with the same controlled precision she had brought to every other aspect of her work in that household. The pig's blood, purchased from a Smithfield butcher 5 days before the murder. Cash, a plain bonnet and a simple dress. The letter to Scotland Yard, written 3 days before, timed to arrive the morning after. The sharpening of the letter opener, Pembroke's own from his own desk, over the course of several weeks, a few strokes each evening with a fine whetstone she kept in her room. "He never noticed," she said. "He used it to open letters. He never tested the edge. Why would he? It was an ornament to him. It was something else to me." She described the night of the murder without flourish and without evasion. The evening routine, the correspondence summary delivered at 8:30. Tea with Mrs. Price in the kitchen from 9:30. The wait. Mrs. Price checks the front door every night at 10 o'clock. She has done so for as long as I have been in this house. 5 minutes, sometimes 7. I counted them. I had counted them for months. When Mrs. Price left the kitchen, Emily rose. She took the jar of pig's blood from where she had concealed it beneath her apron. She climbed the stairs. She entered the study. He was at his desk. He looked up. He smiled. Her voice, for the first time, lost its steadiness, not breaking but thinning, like a wire drawn too taut. He asked if I had the evening's correspondence. I said yes, and I approached. I held the letter opener beneath the papers in my hand. I drove it upward, beneath his left ribs, in a single motion. She stopped, drew a breath, continued. He made a sound, not a scream, a gasp, like surprise, as though he could not quite believe that something had interrupted his evening. And then nothing. He slumped forward onto the desk. I held him there for a moment. Then I worked. The body, the waistcoat buttoned over the wound, the repositioning, upright in the chair, hands placed on the desk, the message on the wall, written with the pig's blood and a cloth wrapped around her finger, the file removed from the cabinet and concealed in the false bottom of her travelling trunk, the letter opener cleaned with oil and replaced in its brass stand, the jar hidden again beneath her apron. I was back in the kitchen before Mrs. Price returned. I sat down. I picked up my teacup. It was still warm. She looked at her hands. The knuckles had relaxed. The colour had returned. "My hands did not shake," she said. "I had expected them to. I'd prepared myself for trembling, for nausea, for some physical rebellion against what I had done. There was nothing, only silence, and the knowledge that it was finished. She raised her eyes to Holmes. "He wrote lies in ink, Mr. Holmes." I answered in blood, not because I wanted to kill him. I've spent 10 years preparing for this, and in all that time the killing was never the purpose. It was the key that opened the door, the letter, the message, the missing file. Every element was designed to lead an investigation here, to this room, to this cabinet, to the name Daniel Ward. I did not care whether you found me. I cared that you found him, that the world would learn what Arthur Pembroke did to my father, that someone at last would say his name and know that he was innocent. The silence that followed was the longest I've ever endured. It was Holmes who broke it. He had not moved throughout her confession. He had stood behind the desk with his hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable, his grey eyes fixed on Emily Ward with an intensity that I had seen him direct at the most dangerous criminals in London. But there was no contempt in his expression, no triumph. If anything, there was something I had almost never seen from Sherlock Holmes, and which I would not have believed possible had I not witnessed it myself. Recognition. "Miss Ward," he said. His voice was quiet. "You constructed one of the most intricate deceptions I have encountered in 20 years of practice. You designed a crime that was also a confession. You staged a murder scene that was also a trial. You built a narrative so complete, so precisely engineered, that Scotland Yard would have followed it exactly where you intended, into Pembroke's past, into his corruption, into the truth of what he did." He paused. "And your only mistake was being too meticulous. A crime of passion leaves chaos, broken furniture, a dropped weapon, blood where it should not be. You left none of that. You left a story, clean, controlled, perfectly composed." He gestured to the faint remnant of the message on the wall. "And stories, Miss Ward, have authors. The moment I identified the blood on that wall as non-human, the narrative collapsed. If the message was prepared in advance, the killer had a plan. If the killer had a plan, they had access. If they had access and the victim showed no fear, they were trusted. The circle tightened to this household, and within this household, only one person had access to both the study and the private files. Only one person showed no surprise, no fear, no confusion. Only one person had been invisible. Emily looked at him, and she smiled, not broadly, not bitterly, but with the quiet, exhausted grace of a runner who has crossed a finish line she was never certain she would reach. "You were not part of my plan, Mr. Holmes. I planned for Scotland Yard. I planned for men who follow narratives. I did not plan for a man who dismantles them." "No," Holmes said, "you did not." The clock in the hall below struck 3. The sound drifted up through the floorboards like a summons from another world, the ordinary world, the world of time and schedules and routine, which had been suspended in this room for the duration of Emily Ward's confession, and which now, with gentle insistence, reasserted itself. Lestrade stepped forward. His face was drawn, and he held his notebook as though it weighed a great deal more than paper and leather. "Miss Ward," he said, "I must ask you to come with me." Emily stood. She smoothed her skirt with both hands, a small, automatic gesture, the habit of a woman who had spent 3 years ensuring that every detail of her appearance was correct. She looked around the study one last time, at the desk, at the cabinet, at the wall where her message had been written and scrubbed away. "The file is in my trunk," she said, "in the false bottom, along with my aunt's letters and an account I have written of everything Mr. Pembroke did. I should like it to reach the right hands." She looked at Holmes when she said this. Not at Lestrade, at Holmes. Then she walked out of the study, and Lestrade followed, and the door closed behind them with a soft, final click. Chapter 10. The Weight of Justice. The house was very quiet after they took her. Reginald Pembroke remained in the drawing room for some time, seated in the same chair, staring at the carpet with the blank expression of a man whose understanding of the world has been rearranged without his consent. Hargreaves stood at the top of the stairs, his hands clasped before him, watching the front door as though Emily Ward might walk back through it and resume her duties. Mrs. Price wept in the kitchen, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the steady, exhausted persistence of a woman who has run out of every resource except tears. Holmes moved through the house with quiet purpose. He climbed the narrow staircase to the servants' quarters on the 3rd floor and located Emily's room, a small, spare chamber with a single window overlooking the mews. The bed was neatly made, a plain dress hung on a peg beside the door. On the washstand sat a brush, a comb, and a small framed photograph, a man and a woman, young, standing before what appeared to be a terraced house. The man wore a dock labourer's cap and had his arm around the woman's waist. They were smiling. I did not need to ask who they were. The travelling trunk stood at the foot of the bed. Holmes knelt beside it and worked his fingers along the interior base until he found the seam. The false bottom lifted away to reveal a shallow compartment containing 3 items: a brown cardboard file, the Daniel Ward case file, removed from Pembroke's cabinet, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and a sheaf of papers covered in a neat, disciplined hand that I recognised as Emily's. Holmes examined the case file first. He read it in silence, turning pages with the care of a man handling something both fragile and combustible. When he had finished, he closed it and held it for a moment, resting it on his knee. His expression was one I had seen only rarely, a stillness that was not calm but controlled, the way a man controls his breathing when he has been struck. "It is all here, Watson," he said. "Greeley's testimony. I annotated in Pembroke's handwriting with instructions on what to say. The payments, £3, 10 shillings, in 2 instalments. And at the bottom, he opened the file again and withdrew a single folded sheet, a signed statement from a man named Clough, a night watchman, placing Thomas Briggs at the Royal Victoria Dock on the night of Fenton's murder, dated 2 days before the trial, never presented, never disclosed to the defence, buried. He replaced the sheet and closed the file. Daniel Ward was innocent. Pembroke knew it. He prosecuted him anyway, suppressed the evidence that would have freed him, and built his career on the conviction. And then he filed the proof of his own corruption in a locked cabinet and lived with it for 23 years. He gathered the file, the letters, and Emily's written account, and carried them downstairs. In the entrance hall, Lestrade was waiting. He had returned from settling Emily in the police carriage, and stood now with his hat in his hands, looking more uncertain than I had ever seen him. Holmes handed him the file. "See that this reaches the Home Office, Inspector, not Scotland Yard. The Home Office." Lestrade looked down at the file. He opened it, scanned the first page, and I watched his face change, the professional neutrality giving way to something harder and more troubled. He closed the file. This is evidence that Arthur Pembroke fabricated testimony and suppressed exculpatory material to secure the conviction of an innocent man who subsequently died in prison. It is also evidence that the investigation was conducted by Inspector Aloysius Brannigan, now retired, who was aware of irregularities and failed to act. Holmes's voice was level, precise, and entirely without satisfaction. Emily Ward committed murder, that is beyond question, but the crime that led to her crime, the destruction of her father, her mother, her childhood, her entire life, that crime was committed by the law itself, and the law should answer for it. Lestrade held the file as though it were hot. Then he nodded once, placed it inside his coat, and left without another word. We returned to Baker Street as the November afternoon collapsed into early darkness. The fog had thickened again, and the gas lamps along the Marylebone Road burned in dim, haloed isolation, each one an island of yellow light in a grey sea. The cab rattled over cobblestones, and neither of us spoke. At Baker Street, Holmes went directly to the window. He did not remove his coat. He did not sit down. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the street below where the fog erased the world a few feet at a time. I busied myself with small tasks, stirring the fire, pouring 2 glasses of brandy, moving Holmes's violin from the settee to its case, the rituals of normalcy, the things one does when the larger questions are too heavy to lift directly. "She will hang, Watson." His voice came from the window, flat and uninflected, as though he were reporting the weather. "She will be tried, and she will be convicted, and she will hang, for killing a man who destroyed her father on fabricated evidence, who drove her mother to an early grave, who built his career and his reputation and his comfortable retirement on the ruins of an innocent family." He did not turn from the window. "And the men who made it possible, Pembroke, Greeley, the system that allowed a paid informant's testimony to send a man to his death without scrutiny, they will face no gallows. Pembroke is dead. Greeley has vanished into whatever hole men like him find. Brannigan will drink himself into the grave within the year. The institution that permitted it will conduct a quiet review, express appropriate regret, and change nothing." I brought him his brandy. He took it without looking at me, and held it without drinking. Was she justified, Holmes? It was a question I had been turning over since Emily's confession, and I asked it not because I expected an answer, but because I needed to hear him engage with it, to know that the question mattered to a mind that dealt so readily in facts and evidence and logical certainties. Holmes was silent for a long time. The fog pressed against the window. Somewhere below, a cab horse stamped and snorted, and a door closed distantly. "She was not justified," he said at last. "The law does not permit private vengeance, and to exempt her because her grievance was genuine would be to exempt every person who has ever suffered an injustice. And their number, Watson, is beyond counting. The law must hold even when the law itself has failed. That is not justice. It is order, and the two are not the same thing." He paused. "But I will tell you this. In 20 years of practice, I have pursued murderers driven by greed, by jealousy, by madness, by cruelty, and by cowardice. I have felt contempt for most of them, and pity for some. Emily Ward is the first for whom I have felt something closer to respect. She did not kill for herself. She killed to speak a truth that no court, no institution, no authority in this country would allow to be spoken. She built a crime that was also an act of testimony, and she accepted the consequences not as a price to be avoided, but as a price she had already agreed to pay." He raised the brandy to his lips at last, drank, and set the glass on the window-sill. "The law demands order, Watson, but truth is often born of something far less merciful." He did not speak again that evening. He stood at the window until the fog swallowed the last of the street lamps, and the street below became a darkness indistinguishable from the sky. I sat in my armchair with my notebook open on my knee, intending to write, but the words would not come. Not yet. The case was too close. The weight of it had not yet settled into the shape that narrative requires. I thought of Emily Ward in a cell at Scotland Yard, her hands folded in her lap, her composure unbroken. I thought of Daniel Ward behind the glass at Pentonville, his face the colour of candle wax, telling his daughter to be good. I thought of Arthur Pembroke at his desk, smiling, asking about the evening's correspondence, not knowing that the instrument of his destruction had been sharpened on his own letter opener, by the daughter of the man he had buried alive in a prison cell 23 years ago. I thought of justice and of vengeance and of the vast and terrible distance between them. I thought of how a lie written in ink had destroyed a family, and how the truth, when it finally came, had been written in blood. And I thought of Holmes, standing at the window watching the fog, a man who had solved the case with his customary brilliance, and felt for once no satisfaction in the solving. There are cases that Holmes completed with a flourish: the snap of handcuffs, the congratulations of Scotland Yard, the quiet glow of a problem elegantly resolved. And there are cases he completed in silence, with the recognition that the truth, once uncovered, offered no comfort to anyone. This was the latter. I closed my notebook, I set down my pen, and I knew, with the certainty of a man who has told many stories and recognizes the shape of them, that the case of the letter written in blood was not merely closed, it was mourned.